Hello, welcome everyone to this discussion today, which is organized by the Center for Personalized Medicine, which is a partnership between the University of Oxford's Wellcome Center for Human Genetics and St Anne's College, Oxford. The CPM is a communication and engagement vehicle for students, academics, clinicians, and the public to explore the benefits and challenges of personalized medicine. And today, for the next hour, we will be talking about reproducibility in science. And of course, much has been said and written about the issue, with a special focus on the lack of reproducibility in science, or the so-called replication crisis. And so with me today to discuss this, I have Dr. Stuart Ritchie, lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London, and author of the best-selling book, Science Fiction's Exposing Fraud, Bias, Negligence and Hype in Science. I also have Dr. Marcus Munafo, who's professor of biological psychology at the University of Bristol, a long-term champion of registered reports and one of the founders of and leaders of UK Reproducibility Network. And also Dr. Malika Ihle, the first reproducible research coordinator at the University of Oxford. And her research background is in evolution of animal behavior. I will be leading our discussion, and I'm Magdalena Skipper, Editor-in-Chief of Nature and Chief Editorial Advisor at the Nature Portfolio, and by training, I'm a geneticist. Before we launch into the questions, let me just tell you, in case you want to listen to our conversation again, it will be in a few days' time or a week or so, will be available on Center for Personalized Medicine's website. The recording will be there. And also, just to draw your attention, those of you who are listening, there is the Q&A function you will see at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions or comments, please add them there. We may have time at the end to turn to your points. So let me start our conversation with a general point. We've only been hearing about reproducibility crisis in earnest over the past decade and a half, more or less. But is this in fact a new issue? Did something change recently or not? Marcus, can I turn to you to take this question?
So I think that's one of the interesting things. I mean, in Stuart's book, he references Charles Babbage's Reflections on the Decline of Science in England, which I think was published in 1833, where very similar problems that we would today call p-hacking, for example, are described. And I mean, I remember coming across that a few years ago when I first started talking about these issues and being really struck by the similarity. There have always been people who are concerned that we're not doing things well enough. And I think that's healthy. What we're seeing at the moment, in some respect, I think, is the latest instantiation of that, of the community looking in on itself and being self-critical about the way in which it works. The difference is perhaps that it's far more mainstream now as a discussion rather than one or two individuals making critical comments, if you like. And I think that's the interesting question. What is different this time? Is it that there are more of us talking about this, or is it something else to do with the ease with which we can create those communities via the various online tools? But certainly I don't think that it's entirely new, but there is something about this that does feel a bit different to me.
Oh, it's interesting. Stuart, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what Marcus said, but I think in kind of the last decade, it's a kind of a confluence of really high profile things that kicked off in psychology, the replication crisis. You had the fraud, a couple of high profile cases of fraud. You had the high profile case of the paper on psychic powers being published in a mainstream psychology journal. Although it must be said, papers on psychic powers had been published in mainstream psychology journals. In fact, even higher impact psychology journals through the 90s. This had been a thing for a while. So you had that plus the fraud, and a couple of other cases where findings that were in all the textbooks about things like priming and so on. So this whole idea that if you sort of seed people's minds with the idea of older people, then they'll walk more slowly out of a room. That was a famous one that kind of fell to bits once someone tried to replicate it. So it was almost like there was this kind of confluence of factors that kind of kicked off this replication crisis idea. But I think it stuck for the reason that Marcus said, which is we have the technology now to do something about it. Whereas back when people were writing about this in, the 1970s and so on, it was really hard to share data. It was really hard to comment on other people's manuscripts. It was really hard to do all the stuff that we now consider to be open science, even though the idea of open science has been around for quite some time.
Very good point. Malika, anything to add to this?
I'm not sure there would be new points, but I think, yes, in this era where the whole research community really can access research outputs with the new technologies, I think also favor this new perspective here.
Yeah, and of course, it's interesting what you say about the tools to address the problem. And of course, there are also the tools of communication. So we have so many more platforms to be talking about it all the time. And of course, I'm principally thinking about social media here, right? The conversation can keep going with many actors at the same time, rightly so. And so actually, in some way, by extension, I want to ask you, Stuart, specifically. So, we just agreed this is not a new problem as such. And you published your book last year, right? It just came out in 2020. So what compelled you to write the book now?
Well, I think I saw about a decade's worth of progress. So I was actually involved in trying to replicate that psychic powers paper that I mentioned, which was one of the kind of sparks of the replication crisis within psychology. And that was when I was a PhD student back in 2011. And kind of since then, I've kind of watched this happen, this replication crisis thing. And it was everywhere. It became, it spread out of psychology into other subjects, kind of meshed in with discussions that had already been had in areas like medicine, particularly where people had been talking about, registering trials and outcome switching. And you had all the work of people like, Ben Goldacre and so on, not just dodgy medicine stuff as in homeopathy and acupuncture, but dodgy medicine stuff as in published in the scientific journals. And so I kind of saw that as a good opportunity to just summarize what's been happening, particularly with reference to the problems. I think, I read a lot of popular science books. I review quite a lot of them. I reviewed one just last week, which shall remain nameless, but it was full of bad research. It was full of low quality scientific studies that were used by the author to buttress their point. And I think people who read popular science books need to be aware of all these problems because they need to be kind of more critical consumers, I guess, of the stuff that they're reading. So I think there's been 10 years of progress in science, in open science, and in trying to deal with these problems, and certainly identifying these problems with meta science. But I'm not sure that the discussion has really caught up in the popular media. So that's kind of one of the reasons, anyway, that I thought this would be a good time to write this.
Interesting. And so let's sort of put a marker in these comments about bringing these topics to the attention of the general public. I'd like to come back to it at some point a little bit later. I think I personally find this a very interesting and an important issue. But let's get some other topics on the discussion table. First, let me turn to you, Malika. So you hold the post of Reproducible Research Coordinator at Oxford, and you're the first person in this role. Can you tell us a little bit more what this function is and how it came about? Like, how come it was created?
Yes, so Reproducible Research Oxford is, which is also known by its acronym ROX, is an initiative which aims to promote open research across the entire collegiate university. And it is led by researchers of all career stages, as well as research support staff from the university services. And they hired me a year and a half ago after receiving a university internal grant to be the full-time coordinator of that network, because they realized that there were many grassroots initiatives at Oxford, often led by early career researchers who did not necessarily know about each other. And so I guess ROC's main aim was to provide a coordinated approach to open scholarship and reproducible research that extends across all disciplines really at the university. And so my role specifically is to help grow this multidisciplinary community of practice by supporting the development and connections between those grassroots initiatives. I also organize and provide training, such as lectures and workshops targeting graduate students, but open to anyone. And I also liaise with internal and external stakeholders to help define curriculum, incentives, and policies on open research and responsible research assessment. And I'm also the UK Reproducibility Network local network lead at Oxford, and make sure our activities are aligned with the national efforts.
That's great. And so you mentioned, actually, of course, now the UK Reproducibility Network, and you're being a liaison with external stakeholders. So is this position being replicated in other university settings, either in the UK or elsewhere? Is there appetite for it?
Well, I think there is, but perhaps Marcus can answer that question more deeply. But I guess the unique thing about Oxford is that yeah, I'm funded full-time, and in others, university, like the other UKRN local network league, are usually researchers. And so they do this voluntarily on the side, and we all wish they'd be better recognized. And I think Marcus has tried to improve that. And yeah, internationally, I think that's also the case. I've now started to see other job advertisement for similar roles, usually at the level of departments. This is really the only one that I know at the moment, but I think it is expanding. That is really at the level of the university.
Mm-hmm. That's very encouraging. Marcus, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, well, so I mean, Malika is right. There's a lot of appetite at the grassroots for this kind of change. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm not terribly keen on the crisis narrative is that I think it's, if anything, more of an opportunity, because there's so much appetite to do things differently, and we have the tools, as Stuart was saying, to do things in a different way now. One of the challenges is how to harness all of that energy and enthusiasm for improving the ways in which we work. And one of the things that we've tried to do through the UK Reproducibility Network is to do exactly that. So we have now, I think, local networks at over 55, well, over 50, I think it's about 55 institutions in the UK. And they range considerably in size and resourcing, from the one that you've heard about from Malika in Oxford, which is well resourced and quite mature as a local network, through to PhD students running journal clubs and trying to bring in colleagues at all career stages across a range of disciplines. So it's very variable, but certainly there is that grassroots activity. The next step, of course, is to draw that up into university senior management, which is why we have institutional members, and we have 19 of those at the moment, and also to create a direct link through to the other stakeholders, the funders and the publishers and so on, because all of these issues that we're talking about are in a sense systemic, and so you need to have a systems view of how to coordinate change, and you're not going to be able to do that effectively unless you are directly engaging the grassroots, the researchers themselves at all career stages, and the institutions and the funders and the other sectoral organizations and so on.
Yes, and I appreciate what you said about not being very fond of the crisis narrative. I'm certainly there with you. Nevertheless, just for a moment, before we get to the solutions or even prevention, let's just explore this issue of crisis. So to delve more deeply, I'm going to ask you one of these, magic wand questions. So if each of you could name two main reasons for this reproducibility crisis, what would they be? And I'm going to start with you, Marcus, and then I'll ask Malika and then Stuart.
So I think the first is that it's that science is a human process and humans are fallible, and fallible unconsciously as much as consciously. So I think that's a big part of it. And, you know, when we talk about incentives, well, those are the things that shape human behavior because humans respond to incentives. That would be one part. I think another part would be technology, which is a double-edged sword, I think. It allows us to do more research and research more rapidly, but it also allows us to do things unthinkingly. So if you look at some of the statistical software packages that exist, it's easy to run 100 statistical tests in a way that 30 years ago would have been much more difficult, if not impossible. And that then creates the scope for the human factors to come into play, if you like. So it's one of the contributing factors and is one of those things that represents, I think, a potential threat to how we work, but also potential solutions, because the technologies that exist now also allow us to do things in a much better way, I think.
Right. Malika?
I guess it's just a new formulation of the same points. But I think, yeah, we can discuss this question at different levels, like talking about the ultimate like incentive, for instance. But I think in my roles, what I talk about most with researchers during training, I usually focus on proximate causes. I think these are the things that the researchers can act on directly, like starting today. And so to the question, why wouldn't studies replicate, you know, that why wouldn't exactly or closely repeated independent studies not reach the same outcome? Usually I argue that it comes from the lack of two things. The first one being the lack of reproducibility of studies, which is most commonly defined as the process by which, given the same raw data, the same question, the same method, someone of similar knowledge reaches the same conclusion. And you'd think that at least the authors themselves should be able to do that, but this is actually not always the case. And I think, yeah, reproducible research would be most efficiently achieved by using those tools that Marcus mentioned, typing and documenting all of the comments that are needed to create a workflow. For instance, to process and analyze data, rather than clicking, copying, and pasting in the software that people have used or are used to use so far. And so nowadays there are, yeah, lots of tools and technologies that can help achieve that, but they do take some time to learn and haven't been traditionally taught, so they aren't part of their typical workflows in most fields. But attending a 3-day workshop can already be really transformative, and these are the type of things that ROX offers at Oxford. And the second thing that, in my opinion, produces findings that do not replicate is a lack of reliability of studies. Also, repeating a bit what Marcus said, where basically readers of scientific articles are very often told that there is only a low probability for a significant result to have occurred only by chance. While in fact, current research practices increase drastically the likelihood of false positive finding, where we detect an effect when no true effect exists. And this is because even though we may have had a plan prior to conducting a study, once we analyze our data, we may change things ever so slightly, possibly with the best of intention to find all the effect that a data set may contain. But by giving the same data another chance of giving a positive result, we are not conducting like 2 independent tests. We're just increasing our likelihood for discovering a false positive finding. And because researchers are humans, choosing the most appropriate analysis route over another after seeing the results means that they can't guarantee really that they did not fall victim of their human biases, like hindsight bias or confirmatory bias or selective attention bias, etc. So this lack of commitment to a plan decided a priori, sometimes combined with a lack of understanding of our complex statistical tools and how we can very easily produce and easily publish false positive finding, means that that such reported findings don't replicate. They were just found by chance or even forced chance, in fact. So yeah, I think researchers can increase the likelihood of their findings to be replicable by increasing the reliability of their work, by taking decisions before seeing the impact that this decision has on the result, and by improving the reproducibility of their workflows by upgrading their computing skills.
Thank you. That really nicely actually fleshes out Marcus's points. Stuart, do you want to add anything? And I also kind of related to this. Want to point out, I don't know how many of you listening to us have read Stuart's book, but of course it opens with this very dramatic sentence, which is printed on its own, you know, it almost has its own paragraph. It says, science is a social construct. So in addition to answering the question I just asked, if you want to just explain a little bit about that, that would be terrific.
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree with the reasons that have been given by so far. So I'm completely on board with all that. I think one way of summing it up, and this fits in with the science as a social construct thing, is that scientists trust each other a little bit too much, right? I think that might be one of the kind of fundamental issues. One of the Mertonian norms that are put forward of kind of the general aspirational norms that scientists might want to follow. One of them is organized skepticism, that we're constantly arguing with each other, we're constantly questioning each other's findings and arguments and experiments and studies and so on. And I think we've either got to the point, or perhaps it's always been this way, that we're too trusting of each other. So in the extremes, this means that people can be taken advantage of by fraudsters who commit scientific fraud and then bring down their whole research groups. It happens quite often that people realize, oh my goodness, I didn't look at this guy's data, but actually, you know, if you look at it in more detail, it turns out to be a fraudulent data set. But less extreme than that, it can lead to just not checking what our colleagues are doing, taking stuff on faith, when of course we know that the motto of the Royal Society is nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. That's science distilled right down, is take nobody's word for it. And yet we're all taking each other's word for it all the time in many ways. Now that's unavoidable sometimes because we can't go back and check every single analysis, every single data point. We can't go back to the original place that the data points were collected and make sure that they're all 100% accurate. So we have to take things on faith to some degree, but not perhaps to the degree that we're doing it right now. And that's where the social process comes in, is that we're supposed to be, and that's what I meant when I said that science is a social construct, is that the scientific findings that we see are produced from this back and forth of researchers, or are supposed to be produced from this back and forth of researchers arguing with each other. I thought I'd put that as a provocative statement because I could see some people like raging when they see that. Oh, what do you mean science is a social construct? Does that mean it's this, you know, it's just made up or anything? And no, I don't mean that at all. I mean that it's brought, it comes through human beings, and that's, you know, to go back to what Marcus said about, you know, it being a human process, it being subject to human biases. So trusting each other a little bit too much, but I also think we trust ourselves a bit too much as well. We trust that we are getting everything right. And that's what Malika was saying about, you know, copying and pasting errors and all the sorts of like basic things that we think we're doing right, but actually it turns out that we're not. And that's when I was, you know, talking about negligence in the book. We're making these errors. We're not necessarily holding ourselves to a higher standard by, you know, as we've discussed, writing the plans down beforehand, getting other people to check what we're doing, having a co-pilot checking your statistical analysis, whatever you want to call it. So I think trusting ourselves and trusting each other a little bit too much are the fundamental issues here. And then you can go a level down to talk about the incentives that push us towards making more of those mistakes. But I think that's what I'll throw into the discussion for now.
That's great. Thank you. And so both you and Malika touched on a couple of things that I wanted to ask next. And so again, sticking with your book, Stuart, you developed these separate chapters to issues like bias and negligence and hype. And so how clear-cut are those boundaries? Can we discuss this a little bit? You know, I can imagine that, for example, bias might blend into hype, and how important is it to create these boundaries? Who would like to start?
Well, I'll jump in since it's my rubric, I guess. Yeah, I think certainly the first two chapters, fraud and bias, are clearly on a spectrum, right? In that there are clearly some people who know that they're committing fraud and do that, completely in the knowledge that and then try and hide it and so on. And then there are some people who might be doing something we would consider p-hacking, something a bit dodgy in terms of statistics, and know the effect it has, and yet do it anyway. And we might argue that in some of those cases that might be considered misconduct of some kind. And then there are people who are completely unconsciously biased and are completely well-meaning and are just doing things wrong that makes it more likely that they're going to get false positive or unreplicable results. So there's a spectrum there. I think the negligence stuff can come about through bias. So you see examples, for instance, the paper on the stat check algorithm that checked statistics in thousands and thousands of psychology papers and found a really dreadful percentage of mistakes. It turned out that they were more likely to make a statistical mistake when that favored their hypothesis, right? So they were kind of being negligent in that they were making an error, but they were also being biased in that they checked the errors more if they went against their hypothesis, right? It was kind of too good to check if the error was in favor of their hypothesis. So, or at least that's one interpretation of those data. And then I think the hype also can be is an offshoot of the bias in some degree, right? Because we're all biased towards finding the effects we want to find, and then we want to shout those out on the rooftops and draw loads of attention to our study, so we get more citations, more funding in future, and so on. And if the bias is very strongly in favor of positive results, as we know it is from lots of studies of publication bias, then the hype kind of gets wound up in that. And as you said, we'll come back to talking about how science gets out into the public, but that's another aspect of the hype there. So I think bias is probably the fundamental thing that drives most of these issues, but I think it's still useful to talk about fraud and bias and negligence and hype as separate things.
Yes, and a very good point. So I deliberately didn't include fraud in my question because I felt, that was quite clear cut. But importantly, from my perspective as a long-term editor, I sometimes have this perception that there is a group, a constituency, if you like, in the community who believes that all of the issues with replication arise as a result of fraud. And that's very clearly not the case. But there is that sort of tendency amongst some to use that very broad brush. And I would, in my experience, actually, there's probably the minority and the other things that you discussed. Any other comments from you, Malika or Marcus?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd say is, first of all, to Stuart's point about how we trust each other too much, I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think to some extent we all kind of go along with the conceit that we can be trusted, because that keeps the operation ticking over, if you like, and we all stand to benefit from that. So there's almost an incentive around that kind of high level of the role of trust in science as well. But I think that question of trust versus the trustworthiness of the process is something to potentially come back to. In terms of those different elements that you were talking about, I don't think there are clear distinctions, because I think, individually and in terms of the behaviors, we lie along a spectrum. So you have the outright fraudsters, the Diederik Stapels, who just, typed fake data into a spreadsheet and then printed off questionnaires to go and burn somewhere, basically, to pretend that it had all happened. And then you have the platonic ideal of the, disinterested scientist who can admit that they're wrong as soon as the evidence changes. And there are pretty few of those as well, actually, because we're all invested in our own ideas, not necessarily consciously, but we care about what we do. Most of us are in the middle. And one of the problems is that behaviors that are problematic, or research practices that are problematic, often become so normative, and this goes back to the trust point, I guess, that they're not seen as a problem anymore. So, we're told you need to explore your data, which of course is fine, but we're also told you need to have found something to publish. So the conflation of those two means you sort of thoroughly interrogate your data in a slightly kind of overly enthusiastic way, and then say, oh, look, this one was really exciting, let's publish it. And because everyone does that, or many people do that, it's not seen as problematic in perhaps the way that it should be, or the ramifications aren't understood. So, there is a spectrum, and actually working out where the boundaries lie can be difficult. If it's okay to Photoshop your images a bit, at what point does it stop becoming okay?
Yeah, very good point. And if I can just jump in here, You know, your comment about publishing and needing to find something to publish. You know, one of the really gratifying developments that I have certainly seen during my time as an editor, and that has been, you know, almost exactly 2 decades now, is that there is increasing interest amongst editors and journals to publish data sets or approaches or methodologies. So there doesn't have to be that sort of shiny endpoint that you know, we sort of caricaturing here. Nevertheless, that issue has clearly not gone away, but I think we are appreciating different types of outputs. I'm just going to check, Malika, did you have any other points to make, you know, about these? How useful is it to sort of differentiate on the spectrum of behaviors, if you like?
Well, I guess, well, these things are connected mainly because they stem from the same ultimate cause, like the current way researchers are being judged in order for them to progress in their career, or even just being allowed to stay in academia, which seems to be mostly based on quantity of article published and the prestige of the outlet that they publish in. And bias, negligence, and hype would also be solved by the same like general shift in research culture, one that would normalize and favor like rigor, the communication of certainty and transparency and quality over like novelty and alleged impact. So in that sense, I think they're very much linked. But I think bias, negligence, and hype are being distinguished, for instance, in this book, because maybe they occur and they can be remedied at different stages of the research life cycle. So researchers, for instance, they need to protect themselves from biases, mostly at the planning stage. They need to add up pipelines to process their data in codes that would make it easier for them and their team to spot mistakes, like while the research is happening. And then, you know, they need to communicate their certainty at the press release stage, for instance. So I think that's why perhaps it's somewhat useful to distinguish them.
Yes, thank you. So we've been talking about mistakes and cases where, you know, science and scientists are not correct. And there's a certain, certainly my experience as an editor, there's a certain degree of fear of being shown to have been incorrect. At the same time, there is, of course, this old adage, science progresses through self-correction. Should we expect science to be correct all the time, or can we unpick these different reasons? And, you know, should we be more open about this within the community, but also out with?
Well, if I can jump in, I kind of try and draw the distinction in the book between correct, i.e. true, which I don't think we're ever going to, you know, the whole point is that we're trying to get towards that, but it's not that we're ever going to have a paper that is eternally always true, and that's the end of it. But so that there's that on the one hand, but there's accurate on the other hand, and what I mean by that is that the paper actually reports what the scientists did, and it doesn't have typos in it. It doesn't have copy and paste errors. It doesn't have hyped up language that doesn't actually describe the, you know, the how strong the results are. It doesn't have statistical methods that find things in statistical noise. You know, so it's not that the findings have to be true. It's that the literature that we're reading has to be an accurate representation of what the scientists were doing. And on a higher level, at the level of not just a paper, but at the level of literature, the literature should show all the stuff that's being done, right? And that's obviously the problem with publication bias, where we don't see huge amounts of stuff that's done and put in the old file drawer and the anachronistic term that we use to describe that. That's possibly a useful distinction, is that it's kind of a sort of straw man a response I've had in a few cases from people saying, well, you're saying that science should be true. No, of course not. We've had theories in the past that were superseded, and that's always going to be happening, of course. But what the problem that we have is that the stuff that we see the stuff that we read in our papers, it's not just that we view it as provisional. It's that sometimes it's wrong, and we can't really rely on the fact that it's even an accurate description of what the scientists did.
Good point. Any other comments from anyone
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a useful distinction. You know, we might want our research outputs to be accurate, transparent. Ideally, the findings will be robust, but of course, not all of them are going to be, because we always have to take a degree of risk in science. We're going to make some mistakes and so on. So I think we need to be kind of clear about which of those elements are valuable and why, and what we would expect the standard to be for each of those, which might be slightly different. We would hope that our research outputs are going to be maximally accurate and ideally maximally transparent, although there'll be caveats there depending on the context. We wouldn't expect all of our research findings to be 100% replicable, for example, because then there would be no risk, we would end up either doing very dull research or putting far too much funding into single studies, for example. So in each of those cases, there's the right balance to strike.
Great. So let's now, I picked on your comment, Marcus, that you prefer to focus away from the crisis. So let's move away from the crisis and sort of focus on the integrity part, which as I say, my views are very, very much aligned with this. So when I think about it, of course, I think about prevention and remedies. So let's talk about prevention first. When I think about prevention, for me, this centers around training and then also the right set of incentives. Would you agree? And would you like to comment on this? Who would like to take this first? So do you see the training and incentives as sort of balanced when you think about prevention, or is there something else that is crucial here?
For me, I think there's one other thing that we can do if we step back from that kind of detail of what we would focus on, to think to what extent are we looking in the wrong place. I think a lot of our focus is on research output. So, journal articles being the primary one of those, although there are other research outputs now like data sets and so on that are increasingly becoming part of what we discuss when we talk about research outputs. But the focus on research outputs means that we allow all of the research to happen and then check it when it's all done via peer review. And I think we should be focusing much more on the process and having this, turn the spotlight on the research process. And if you get the process right, I would suggest the outputs will to some extent look after themselves. You'll still need to check them, but less so, because you've checked the process and you know that that is transparent and that there are quality control processes in place for that. And that should mean that the research outputs that flow from that process are all of those things that we talked about earlier, accurate and transparent and so on.
Excellent point. Malika, I wonder if you have a comment on.
Well, for me, training is everything. Like, we need to provide an adequate and inclusive training to all relevant actors before, considering taking perhaps the next step, implementing mandates, for instance, from journal or funders. I think training is the necessary first step to alleviate that initial barrier to adoption. And I also think with community training, researchers can then also decide what makes most sense for their particular research and have a voice in shaping those new practices to adapt them to their specific field of research. But I also think infrastructure as well, the creation of all those infrastructure to allow the storage and reuse of those research output that we call researchers to share transparently is something needed, and that requires funding, and that should also be given priority.
So can I ask you about training? When you were initially introducing your role and explaining how it came about, one of the things you emphasized, or at least it emerged as emphasized in my mind, was that a lot of these initiatives and needs came from early career researchers. So how important is training as an ongoing effort and priority? I have a feeling that we talk a lot about training for early career researchers, rightly so. But to me, what's missing is that there is a need for ongoing training throughout scientific career. Can you comment on that? I can see there's nodding already in the panel.
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes we hope too much for a change in research culture by like a generational change, but people are in place, and those skills are not easily learned. So yeah, I think we should provide training specifically for PIs. So that they can not, especially in terms of computing skills and reproducible workflows, so that they don't break that chain of reproducibility just when they comment on manuscript. Like, they need to be able to participate in that new way of working. And I think we could target some training just for that. Not that they learn all of it, but at least that they encourage their students to embrace those practices and be able to interact with it.
Yes, excellent point. Stuart, you were nodding, and I think you want to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I totally agree, and I think the incentives to do open science need to be for early and later career researchers. We just set up a little research award in our institute at King's, where there's a separate one for more established researchers and one for early career researchers, to try and encourage people at different stages to do some open science stuff and be more transparent. But it's tricky, right? We were in a system where, and this goes back to the sort of the training of early career researchers and PhD students and so on. We're in a system where the incentives still point in many ways towards doing lower quality research, because that's just the way it is. So just one example, I once did a talk about statistical power, or at least that was part of the talk. And someone put their hand up and said, I'm a PI, I've got PhD students, they're doing rats running around mazes, and they can't possibly do high-powered rat running around mazes research because they can't afford it, and they need to get papers out right now, otherwise they're never going to get a postdoc. And what do you say? What do you say to that? And I get, one answer is that we need to change the way that we work so that people collaborate on bigger projects rather than just running, one small project in their lab and being forced to publish only that on 20 mice. Marcus, you were not a co-author on the very well cited power failure paper, where the number of mice or rats is way below what you would really need to detect the sorts of effect sizes that you would expect in a lot of these neuroscience experiments. So, what do we do in that case? I actually don't, apart from saying, well, they should be collaborating, I'm not sure what the answer is to that question that the PI asked me. Like, what do you do in a situation where the PhD student needs to publish low quality research?
Well, that's a terrifying statement you just made, right? Especially if repeated in isolation. The PhD student needs to publish low quality research. It contributes to all sorts of issues. And of course, there's another dimension to this is, why do we place so much emphasis on sort of numbers of papers in many institutions? It's a number of papers that a PhD student needs to publish in order to graduate, especially that we know that a large proportion of these graduates will leave active research. So, what are we doing? There's sort of, in this sort of dramatic way of paraphrasing you, that we're kind of encouraging them to litter the system, if you like, and then leave promptly.
It's like an arms race as well. There's some evidence, I think, both anecdotally and there's published evidence on this, that the number of papers that a PhD student has when becoming a postdoc in at least some disciplines is way higher now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so this idea of litter, although it does seem insulting to say it, but in many cases, sadly, that is true, is becoming worse, and at least in some fields, according to the evidence I've seen.
This is great. We are 40 minutes into the conversation and the gloves have come off. Very good. So I'm going to move us on to the remedies, because we were talking about prevention and remedies. Okay, so things have gone wrong, right? These papers, examples we just discussed, some of have been published, things have gone wrong. So how do we fix things? And, from my perspective as an editor, this, first and foremost, of course, it means correcting the publication record, and journals issue corrections and retractions. But how well do you think this works? I'm going to turn to Malika first for your comments. What's your view?
In terms of correcting the existing literature, well, first of all, I think we would need to have founders, journals, and institution rewards the maintenance of science and error detection, and value replication and post-publication review. and such things, because as long as this isn't the case, most researchers won't be able to afford to invest time in these activities, especially given that correction and retraction are still very much stigmatized and amalgamated with misconduct. So, but a way to remedy this in the future, which I think would help with not having so much errors to correct in the first place, would be to fund roles like data managers, software engineers, and statisticians, people with specialized expertise that the academic system actually produce, but don't currently keep. And these are people who can be professionally indifferent to the outcome of particular studies, which would definitely help with reducing biases. And have such experts, like both in the research teams and as editors in journals, would greatly improve things, I believe. But this would also imply that we would like to move from co-authorship to contributorship, both for publication or any research outputs, and grant proposal to recognize the value of everyone's role in the team. And to come back to, sorry?
No, go ahead, please.
To come back to the publishing system itself, I'm wondering whether journals could change to adopt some of the ways software development works. For instance, have articles be like living documents that can get updated with a new release, like a software release, with the same or different contributors, whether in lights of errors or new methodology or ways to improve things, so that we do not just wait and hope for science to progress through self-correction, but actually correct it in a communal effort. But I don't know what other panelists would think about that. Perhaps it's a bit naive, but these are my thoughts so far.
Very interesting, and you touched on so many different points. If I can just come in there for a second. A couple of things you touched on: authorship and sort of contributionship, if you like. We could spend probably another hour talking about authorship itself and who and why qualifies to be an author as opposed to a contributor, and is that system sufficiently well balanced? I would actually argue that it isn't. Actually, we should probably review that. And the other point that I feel very strongly about that you touched on is the fact that there is so much stigma associated with retraction and in some cases even correction. And it will come as no surprise to you that I, as an editor, so often deal with authors who will do anything not to retract the paper, whereas actually in reality, and actually Marcus, you have very openly talked about how retracting a paper has been a very positive experience, and actually, something I'm proud of, if I can say so. Right, it was the right thing to have done. And
yeah. I mean, it was proud is not necessarily how it felt at the time. I mean, it was an honest error that we discovered before the paper was actually published, but once a DOI had been assigned, so we had to formally retract it. And I remember lying there, really agonizing over just how awful this was going to be, the impact it was going to have on my reputation. And then I thought, well, actually, none of that matters because we found a mistake and we need to sort of correct that. And it might well be horrible, but that's what you do in those situations. And actually, it was very liberating, having got to that kind of point of clarity, that we then did what needed to be done. Exactly how the error arose and how the results panned out in a way that completely fooled us, because we actually generated one random result via an error, and then in a follow-up study replicated that random result. So I learned a lot about just how easily one can be fooled by one's data through that experience. But to your point, I think and there is evidence for this, that it certainly doesn't do any harm for scientists to admit their own errors, and I think we should be encouraging that. The problem is that retraction is a pretty blunt instrument, and you can't really distinguish between forms of retraction or reasons for retraction unless you have the retraction notice, and those retraction notices are often incomplete or sometimes disappear. So there's a whole question there, and for me, that speaks to a deeper point, which is that our whole notion of journal articles is a really kind of antiquated model of how to capture a snapshot of a research process. Because as Stuart said, you know, we very rarely get to the point where we think we absolutely know the answer to something, because knowledge is evolving, the process of science is dynamic. So the idea that we can create these snapshots and sort of lay them down in some kind of archaeological record, given that we have the tools to do things differently now, is, I think, one of the things that we need to be thinking about. You know, do we still need to be publishing articles, given how much bigger and more complex studies are now, how many more authors are involved, how many more moving parts there are to them, how much more of the process we can actually capture through data deposits and protocols and all the rest of it. I think that's the conversation we need to be having.
Very interesting point. Let's talk about formats. And, you know, I remember in sort of, you know, speaking of archaeological record, it seems like a sort of, you know, prehistory times when I started as an editor. And I actually started as a reviews editor on Nature Reviews Genetics. And I remember we experimented with this format of a sort of wiki review. So it would be a live document being updated online, and it was a complete flop. The community was just not interested. I think it was maybe in the context of a journal, it simply didn't work, but I you know, have a very clear memory of that. But let's talk about formats, and we touched on elements of this earlier. You know, at some point, I think, Malika, you mentioned pre-registration, and of course something which is, oh, actually I'm forgetting who, but somebody mentioned pre-registration, something which of course is standard now in the context of clinical trials, but not standard in other contexts. We have, of course, registered reports, and in general, the format of a paper, which with very small modifications has persisted for a very long time in the current form. How much potential is there, do you think? Should we be pushing much more actively for changing these formats? Is that an important part of the remedy to what we're discussing here?
I think the answer is to some degree within your question. You mentioned at the very start that you had experimented with a format at Nature Reviews Genetics, and I think that's the answer, is that we need to experiment more with these things. We're scientists, right? So we should be experimenting, and we should be trying things out. I think you know, I'm always a little bit suspicious of people who come along and say the answer is this, that we need to do with the publication system to change it this way, and this will make it work. Well, you know, maybe, but let's give it a go. So I think I really like the idea that there are kind of overlay journals. People are talking about this idea that you get your peer review done independently, and then the journal becomes like a curation device rather than the people who are deciding whether or not, you know, it sounds like a good idea. Let's give it a go. Let's see if it works. Let's see if anyone submits stuff there, and so on, and assess it using all the criteria of rigor that we've been talking about. I like the idea of, you know, of registered reports very much, and you know, that same journal that started registered reports, Cortex, has now started exploratory reports as well, which are like the other side of the coin. They're about, you know, I don't have a specific analysis that I want to do. I've just got this data set that I think is interesting, and you know, within these parameters, we're going to just muck around and see what's correlated with what, test differences between you know, the treatment and the control group in all different measures, and then use that to generate hypotheses, which I think deals with some of the problems that people have with registered reports and maybe being a bit constricting. Some people worry that they will stop people being creative, you know, which I don't think they necessarily will. I just think that this is another way of doing things. So, and that's an experiment. If it works at Cortex, then people will hopefully take it on and start using it in other journals. So, that's my fundamental point, is that I don't have super strong opinions on what is the answer to fix our current like woes in science, but we should be testing it first before we kind of jump on one answer.
And I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's really exciting that there are so many innovations appearing now, different publishing formats, and the rest of it. And we certainly need to do the work to see what works, to do the meta research to understand whether or not these things work as intended or have unintended consequences. But it's also worth bearing in mind that, you know, some ideas are just before their time, and maybe we need to try them again now that, you know, the tools are available. So I remember, as a master's student, I was working with Stephen Harnad, and this was in the mid-1990s, and he set up an online journal, and no one used it. And it, you know, people were just baffled by the concept. Well, you know, online journals turned out all right in the end. It just, you know, the mid-90s wasn't the time to strike, but later on, they obviously, well, you see where they are now. So some ideas like the one that you described maybe just came in too early, and now there might be more of an appetite for that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And Malika, I think I have a feeling that you are a proponent of pre-registration much more widely than let's say in the clinical trials context. Do you want to add further comments on that?
Yeah, a bit in contrast to what the other panelists have said, like let's experiment. I'm already very much convinced about registered report, and I would hope to see it offered by by all journals that at least that publish at least experimental work like this. I still don't have any arguments against that, and to me that is the answer. Perhaps it was not Stuart say, oh, people saying like, this is the answer, but to me this is really the answer, and I don't see why not implement that everywhere, because so I'm not sure we exactly define what registered reports are, but so far, so this is just to make sure for everyone in the audience. This is when we submit a pre-analysis plan, that the authors submit a pre-analysis plan to the journal, and where before conducting the study and have it peer-reviewed and given in principle acceptance prior to knowing the result of the study. And to me, for experimental work, this is how we claim we do empirical research. So I think we just follow with that plan, because it does resolve most, if not all, of the biases that can push researchers during data analysis to find a more favorable or novel results that completely resolve that issue, and also resolve the issue of publication bias that we've discussed. So yeah, for me, this would be a strong new publishing format that I would like to see more mainstream.
Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of registered reports. It's just that the analysis that we've seen looking at registered reports, I've only seen a couple of papers, and it looks great. For instance, the number of positive results that you would normally expect in the psychological literature is way lower in registered reports. But there are other explanations for that, like the sorts of questions that registered reports ask are different. The sorts of people who submit their paper as a registered report are not the same type of scientists as people who are just submitting into the standard literature. So, there are other explanations for some of the benefits. Although I think in theory, I completely agree that I can't think of a bad thing, especially when there's the option of doing the exploratory reports as well at the same time.
Great, this is terrific. Go ahead, Marcus.
Just very quickly, I mean, I'm a big fan of registered reports, but they're only going to make a difference if people actually use them, which is to Stuart's point to some extent. And there's a great quote, which is that it's difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on not understanding it. And you could say here that it's difficult to get someone to do something when their salary or their job prospects depend on not doing it. And this is the challenge with many of these things. We're asking people to do things differently because it will make things better. But at the moment, there are barriers to that. And that's why we need to think about how to create more positive incentives, tap that kind of grassroots energy for change, work with the institutions and the funders and the publishers and so on, because there's not going to be any one single solution that will serve as a silver bullet.
Absolutely. And if I can just come in on that, often journals such as Nature and of course others are blamed for a lot what happens in the system. And we have repeatedly argued for much more inclusive set of incentives. There are so many different aspects to what researcher does during their career, and all of these aspects ought to be taken into account when evaluating an individual, including indeed, Marcus, what you talked about earlier, that process of science, right? So not just the outcome, but of course there are many other contributions. There are some terrific comments and questions in the Q&A panel. We are not going to have time to get to them, but I wanted us, before we wrap up, I wanted us to make that connection between effectively what we were talking about, this research quality and research culture. Now, those links, and there's a comment about this from John Todd also in the Q&A. So we've been talking about research quality primarily. I personally think this is an excellent and obvious connection to link research culture and quality. But how do you see that connection? And do you believe that integration will genuinely benefit research enterprise and the community itself? And in practice, how can that happen? Who would like to make a comment? And I have to ask you for brief comments because we're going to run out of time.
I'll be very brief. I mean, there's a lot that I could say about that. And I think there's a very interesting intersection of culture and research quality. But I think for me, one of the issues is that our underlying culture in academia is still very kind of 19th century and artisanal, whereas the nature of science now has changed dramatically in that time. And I hesitate to use the word professionalism because I think that's the kind of thing that sets off antibodies in most academics. But more importantly, I think there are still things that we want to retain about, you know, the intellectual curiosity and the academic freedom. But just again, focusing on the process, not assuming that a PhD that you did 20 years ago is the only qualification that you need to see you all the way through to retirement, thinking about how we can update our skills, thinking about how we can standardize some of the ways in which we work through more widespread use of standard operating procedures and that kind of thing, which again, focus on the process rather than the output. I think that cultural change away from an artisanal approach to more of a professional approach, I think could be quite powerful in terms of improving quality.
Thank you. Malika?
Yes, I think if we want to improve research quality, I think we need a research culture that doesn't constantly stress researchers with aspects that are unrelated to research quality, such as productivity in terms of number of papers, for instance. And for this, we need a research culture that encourages mentoring, that promotes diverse roles, that have accountability system as well in place to evaluate the leadership skills of group leaders. And reciprocally, if you want to improve research culture, that is have a working environment where researchers aren't harassed by their managers or feeling obliged to work long hours. I think we need to make it affordable for researchers to invest time in producing transparent research of high quality and still succeed in academia. And for that, I think, changing norms, incentives, and policies, like, for instance, I think productivity should be measured in a variety of ways, not just the quantity of articles published, but also their reusability, their quality, of course. And I think open research practices allow for research output to be reused and allow for the quality of research to be assessed and valued. So I do think, like, the promotion of open research should definitely be part of the first steps to change research culture.
Great. Stuart, last word.
I don't want to just boringly agree, but I do agree with everything that's been said. But I'll just pick up on one thing that came up earlier that I disagree with. I think if you want cultural change, now I do think there's a crisis, and I think we've got ourselves in a crisis situation, a crisis of confidence, whatever you want to call it. But I think if you want cultural change, the crisis narrative is a great thing. And I think saying to people, look, there are serious problems right now with the way we're doing our research that are causing all these downstream issues. I think that's a good thing to have. And as long as there is actually a crisis, and I think there probably is. And so I think that's where we can change a huge amount of the cultural change that's happened already is due to people really worrying, looking at their research and going, is this replicable? Am I part of the replicability crisis? And the answer is, in many cases, yeah, you are. And so that crisis narrative has really helped us change the culture, and will continue to help us change the culture in future years, I suspect.
That's a good point. It can galvanize us into action. And one thing that I would throw into this conversation of which links research culture with research quality is, of course, greater emphasis and appreciation of collaborations, which is the other side of, that sort of competition and unkind, stressful environment that Malika, you were referring to a second ago. We have run out of time, and there are a number of issues we did not touch on. And I think it must be the first conversation ever that I have had about research reproducibility and research quality when we didn't talk about peer review. But that's because there were so many other interesting things that we covered, and I certainly intended to touch on this, but we have run out of time. I wanted to thank my panelists here, and of course all of you in the audience. You've added some terrific comments and questions in the Q&A, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to address these questions. Thank you very much. I suppose a couple of things that I took away from this. Science is a social enterprise, social endeavor. It's done by humans, undeniably. We should place much more emphasis on the process of science and be much more inclusive and collaborative and much more diverse in taking into consideration and evaluating researchers themselves. And on a flippant comment, I hope you can't hear my cat, who is now desperately meowing for her dinner. Thank you very, very much to all of you, and goodbye.
Bye.